27-year-old Dutch driver Nyck De Vries made a very strong impression at this weekend's Italian Grand Prix. But just who is he, and how good was his first weekend in Formula 1? Let's take a look. De Vries has a very strong background in motorsport, but not quite the stellar rise to the top that we've seen from some other drivers who have won each series they've raced in their first attempt in recent years. De Vries won the World Karting Championship back in 2010 and 2011, beating drivers like Alexander Albon along the way. He made the jump to cars in 2012, racing in the Formula Renault Euro Cup, staying in that series for 2013 and then winning the championship in 2014. In 2015, he made the step up to Formula Renault 3.5, which at the time was a rival for GP2, now Formula 2. He stayed there for 1 year, finishing third in the championship with 1 win to his name. For 2016, De Vries moved into GP3, which is the equivalent of today's Formula 3. While Charles Leclerc and Alexander Albon went on to finish first and second in the championship, De Vries could only manage 6th, before moving into Formula 2 for 2017, 2018 and 2019. In his first year in Formula 2, he finished as the highest rookie, 7th in the championship, with 1 win. In 2018, he was much more of a title contender, finishing in 4th place with 3 wins to his name. But 2019 was his breakthrough year, winning the Formula 2 championship with 12 podiums and 4 wins. But this was generally considered a relatively weak field in Formula 2 terms. His closest rival was Nicholas Latifi, who finished over 50 points behind him. But to De Vries' credit, there were several drivers who would also make it into Formula 1 who he was competing against that season. Aside from Latifi, Zhou Guanyu finished in 7th place, Mick Schumacher was 12th, and Nikita Mazepin was 18th. With no Formula 1 drivers available to him for the following year, De Vries moved into Formula E with the Mercedes team, finishing in 11th place in the championship in his first year, before becoming the Formula E World Champion in 2021, but then slumping back down to 9th in the championship in 2022. Alongside his Formula E duties, De Vries was also Formula 1 reserve driver for Mercedes, after testing the 2020 car at the end of the season at Abu Dhabi. But it was this year, 2022, that really began opening doors in Formula 1 for De Vries. He was fielded as a free practice 1 driver for Williams at the Spanish Grand Prix this year, finishing 1/10 of a second ahead of teammate Nicholas Latifi, albeit with all of the caveats you'd normally apply for free practice 1 runs. A higher profile drive came at the French Grand Prix this year, where he replaced Lewis Hamilton for FP1, lapping 6/10 of a second slower than George Russell, again with those caveats applied. Driving his 3rd different Formula 1 car of the season, De Vries also took part in FP1 for Aston Martin at Monza. He finished just under a second ahead of Lance Stroll's fastest lap, and although De Vries was the only one of the 2 to drive with the soft tyres, it was still a very strong showing for his first time in the car. And that was supposed to be the end of De Vries' Italian Grand Prix weekend, until Alex Albon was diagnosed with appendicitis and was ruled out of the rest of the weekend. Apparently De Vries was drinking coffee in the motorhome when he was given the news, and was quickly rushed to the Williams garage to prepare for FP3. In that free practice session, which is the first time he'd driven the car since Barcelona, De Vries was beaten by Latifi by 1/10 of a second, before going on to qualify ahead of him by 2/100ths of a second. Making it through to Q2 on his debut was already quite an impressive feat, and he was looking set to improve on his best lap when he locked the rear tyres and went off at the second chicane. De Vries later put this down to a lack of familiarity with the Williams steering wheel, having changed the wrong setting on the wheel and moving the brake bias rearward by mistake. The steering wheel and dashboard layout of the Williams is actually significantly different to most of the other cars in the field, and by looking at this comparison between the Aston Martin steering wheel and the Williams one, you can see that the dashboard, for example, is static in the Williams, whereas every other team has the dash built into the steering wheel. This means the layout of the buttons is different, and it's not surprising that De Vries would potentially get something wrong when making a switch change. However, despite qualifying 13th, De Vries would actually start on the grid in 8th position due to all of the grid penalties applied to cars further ahead of him. So on to the race itself. De Vries was actually one of the only midfield runners to start the race on soft tyres, and he used those to good effect, getting a good start and actually pulling ahead of Lando Norris initially, who got a pretty bad start. De Vries then maintained his position for the early laps, slotting in behind Alonso and Gasly, and keeping a watchful eye on Zhou Guanyu, who was always breathing down his neck. De Vries then settled down into the midfield DRS train, and managed to maintain his position among the midfield runners, only losing out to the faster cars of Sainz and Hamilton as they moved their way through the pack. Impressively keeping his soft tyres alive until lap 18, he then pitted for mediums and ran those until the end of the race, and something I particularly noticed was just how slick his pit stop was, being a driver who probably hasn't had the opportunity to do too many live pit stop practices. For the remainder of the race, De Vries tried to stick with Gasly whilst fighting off Zhou Guanyu behind him. And aside for a late race scare where under the safety car it was deemed he'd braked erratically while trying to manage a brake problem and drive to the delta time, he had a reasonably uneventful end to his race. De Vries brought the car home in 9th place and could finally relax after a day of very hard work. It was a drive that more experienced racers would be pretty proud of in that Williams, and the fact that he beat his teammate Latifi by such a huge margin despite never having raced the car before really goes to show how much of a solid job De Vries did this weekend. It shouldn't be underestimated just how difficult it is to drive cars with different characteristics at a moment's notice, especially with all the pressure of your first ever Formula 1 weekend on your shoulders. But in my opinion, De Vries got the balance right for the entire weekend of risking just enough whilst maximising his opportunity. The mistakes he made, running wide in free practice 1 in the Aston Martin, missing the second chicane with a rear brake lock in qualifying, they weren't too costly, and it seemed that he'd learned from them immediately and didn't make those same errors in the race when it really counted. It was a calm, composed and very strong drive, and he's almost certainly staked his claim for that Williams seat for 2023. I think the final thing this really goes to prove is not every Formula 1 driver has to be a star that's burst their way onto the scene, winning each series in their first year. De Vries is 27 and he's taken his time to make his way into Formula 1, but he's the kind of driver that's really benefited from that opportunity to mature and learn with multiple seasons in the junior formula. He's had an interesting route to Formula 1, but it looks like if he gets the opportunity to stay, he's going to do a very good job. So what do you think? Albon and De Vries for the 2023 Williams seats. How strong a pairing is that, and how well do you think they'll do? If you've enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in 3 weeks after the next Grand Prix. Thanks for watching.